Good morning. This is Miles Sewer, and I'm thrilled to be doing CIO Chat Live 2.0 virtually. I've got today with me Isaac Sacolick, and he's the author of Driving Digital, and he's been a CIO at a number of companies, and I'm thrilled for the presentation he's about to share with all of you. I know this is recorded, but we're thrilled to be able to do this with you. So I'm going to turn this over to him, and he is going to lead on the presentation. Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you, Miles, and hello, everybody. Miles, thank you for having me on CIO Chat and now CIO Chat Live. And for those of you who only know me from Twitter, here I am in my makeshift studio. I'm officially grounded through the COVID-19 breakout. And so, much like you guys, my career has taken a little bit of a pause as we all figure out what the new life is going to be like and what our new collaboration is going to look like. And, that's what makes presenting to you guys today a little bit around Agile a little bit interesting. One of the things that we try to do in Agile is try to reflect on what the business requires from us and what what the world is changing to. This doesn't look like it's sharing yet.
You are sharing.
I am sharing. Okay, good.
Just put it in presentation mode.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, and it just doesn't want to get there. But I don't know why. We might have to start over, Miles. Let's figure this out. Why isn't it going to sharing? Oh, there it goes. Do we want to start over, Miles?
Unfortunately, the recording, the way it is all messed up, so we'll just do this live.
Okay. All right. Sorry for that little break, everyone, but we're back here. I wanted to make sure you all saw the full slides, but I'm going to talk today a little bit about Agile transformation. And again, Agile, we really think of this as a technology process, sometimes only a development process, and very often really about bringing new applications and software to market. I'm going to talk about it in a more broader sense and talk about culture and innovation and really how to get platforms and standards in place in the organization. So think of it as a more broader way of introducing new things into the organization, as well as a way to change your culture and to get the right collaboration that's required. So we're going to talk a lot about that. As Miles said, I've had a career that started as a CTO in startups. I did that for about a decade. I then pivoted and became a CIO in organizations that were transforming. These were companies that were already feeling the impacts of disruption. A couple of them were in media, one was in financial services, one was in construction. So, some broad experience there. And I started my, experience writing and speaking about 12 years ago. I speak at normally around 15 conferences a year. Last year, I wrote almost 100 articles across CIO and InfoWorld and my blog, Social, Agile, and Transformation. And a lot of what I do is just giving back. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other things I do to help organizations and help businesses. But for the purposes of today, I just want you all to know that I've sat in the seat of leading organizations through some pretty radical transformations, and also leading organizations that had to establish data and technology practices as really core competencies and differentiating capabilities. I didn't have a background working for software companies, and so a lot of my methodologies are really built from the perspective of how do you take an ordinary organization that maybe has historically struggled with customer experience and data and bring them to the forefront. And as I talked about in my book, Driving Digital, I believe Agile is the key to that transformation, largely because it brings multidisciplinary teams together. It requires a business technology collaboration to make sure you're working on the right things. It requires both an innovation and an operational perspective in terms of not just building things, but being able to support it. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But I want to start with a little bit of a story. And this story takes me back to about 2010, about 10 years ago. I was a new CIO at a construction data company about 2 or 3 months in. And this fellow came to see me. He was the new head of one of our products and had a number of product managers reporting to him. And we went through some small talk, and he sat across from me and said, Isaac, I want to understand your roadmap. And so I sat there for a second trying to fully understand what he was asking. I was 2 months into the job. I didn't know the construction industry. I didn't know our products and services well enough. I was just getting my bearings around what the technology was and what our teams were capable of. And so I punted on the question first and a second time. Now, sitting next to me that day was my son. He was about, he's 16 now, so he was 6 at the time. He's playing with his iPad and listening to this. And this product manager asked me over and over again, saying, Isaac, where is your roadmap? Where is something that tells me where you're taking this organization for the next 3 to 6 months? And so I got a little bit frustrated after a little while. And told him, I don't have it yet. I'm still working on it, which is not the greatest answer for a CIO to be able to give back. But my son was sitting there listening to me at the time, and I didn't notice what he was doing. He got up onto the whiteboard and started drawing a roadmap and said, Daddy, here's your roadmap. And so that story really stuck with me for a long period of time, because so much of Agile is really about thinking, how do you get teams aligned on executing in sprints? And sprints are usually 1 or 2 week chunks. They're really good at establishing focus, which is why the execution goes up. But when you're working in the weeds that much, it's really hard to see the forest and see where the organization is going, and be able to come back and say, in 1 month or 3 months, or even in 6 months' time, we're going to be able to actually move the needle and do something new and interesting and innovative for our customers. The other side of this that really bothered me is this entire culture in IT of firefighting. The latest issue, going from an incident to a problem to doing root cause analysis, to the expectation from our stakeholders and our business partners that we're going to be able to go from root cause to figuring out how to solve all of our legacy systems in record time. And so we all know that that's just not possible. And for us to really do larger scale transformative changes to our platforms and to our culture and practices, it's going to have to take most of our people in IT outside of firefighting and into planning and execution and thinking strategically. The last thing I think about is about platforms. And, I have to thank one of the CIO chat members, Ed Featherstone, for the picture on the right. The picture on the left is coming from actually one of the architectures that I inherited. Obviously I took out all the labels, but you could see your databases and your platforms and all the lines in here. And so what really bothered me at the time when I was really doing a lot of Agile work as a CIO was that we were doing so much short-term planning and short-term thinking, short-term building so that we can get software out to our end users, that I wasn't sure we were really building the right foundations. Were we really building platforms? Were they truly scalable? Were they going to be secure? Were they going to be things that you could iterate and evolve over time? Or are we just building another piece of patch and duct tape work on top of an existing architecture and being able to and just being able to add more capability on top of what we have today? So those were my concerns as I took Agile out of my startup routes and into the enterprise, and thinking through, like, how do we make this work when there's scale and there's compliance, there's innovation required, and there's a massive culture change, not just in IT, but in terms of how we're working with the business to be able to pull that off. The other thing that kept in my mind was so much of Agile and so much of transformation is not just about the executives sitting in a room and coming up with strategy and trying to find ways to communicate that down to the organization. That's really, really important. Companies and people need to understand what the priorities are and how to think about customer segments and where there are going to be some real winning hands, and when it comes to compliance, what's really critical. But a lot of what's really required to actually execute on a transformation is really engaging the staff, the people who are going to sit on Agile teams, the people who are innovative, who are ready to experiment, to those that are truly data driven, and can look at analytics and reports and come back and say, this is where the organization needs to go. And so number one reason that I talked about Agile in my book, it was chapter 2, along with a lot of these other practices. I really focused on Agile as the foundation, because without it, it's really hard to get teams aligned and bring multidisciplinary groups together, focus on the execution, but also think about how do you plan for the longer term? How do you actually put a vision statement out there and have a good sense of how to go about building something that's going to scale and last? So I'm going to share some of that with you today in terms of what Agile transformation is really all about for me. Now, when you talk to your teams and you talk to your staff and you talk about Agile, this is what picture largely comes to their mind. They're thinking about Scrum. In some cases, they're thinking about Kanban. I'm going to focus on Scrum here. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through the presentation. But when they hear Agile and they hear Scrum, they're immediately gravitating to the ceremonies that make up an Agile practice. They include coming up with a sprint, which is usually a 1 or 2 week duration. Teams actually planning what parts of their backlog they're going to focus on. They're going to commit to work getting done, which is a highly different dynamic. If you've ever had project managers come in with Gantt charts and saying, this is what the team has to focus on, you're now coming in and saying, here are the priorities. Team, come to me and say to me what you're actually going to get done over that sprint period. That team commits, they go into a sprint. Every day they're having a stand-up. A stand-up is 15 minutes in length. They're looking at the backlog. They're deciding who's working on what. They're making sure they're on the same page in terms of how they're actually constructing things. Most importantly, they're reporting blocks. And typically a Scrum Master is taking those blocks and understanding them as impediments. They are, in fact, servants of the team in terms of making them successful. And they're coming back and saying, here's what we need to do to address the blocks that you're coming out with. At the end of the sprint, you're doing a review. A review basically means a demo to me. You're going back to the product owner and to stakeholders and actually showing them what you've accomplished and getting feedback from them in terms of what looks correct, what needs adjustment for the next sprint. And then you're ending your sprint with what's called a retrospective. And for those of you that are used to conducting root cause analysis and postmortems, a retrospective is applying it at the end of every sprint and really focusing the team on not just executing on delivery, but also executing in process change and reflecting on what's working. So this is what Scrum and really Agile means to most people. It's a real execution-oriented process. You could see planning is really only focused on the next sprint. And so I wanted to go beyond that. And so when I think about sprints and Agile, there are a number of things that come to mind that suggest that this is a winning organizational framework. Number one, I think about roadmaps, again, about being able to go back to the business and say, not only here's what I'm delivering at the end of the next sprint, but here's what I'm delivering over the next month or two or even a quarter, and being able to have that dialogue reliably, even though I know that I'm going to empower the product teams and empower the teams themselves to adjust to priorities as they change. So that's something that's very much ingrained in Agile practices, but it's not giving you the framework to necessarily how to manage that. Number two, I think about platforms and standards. And so if you read the Agile Manifesto, it talks about self-organizing teams. If you read some books out there, they take that to extremes and they say teams should be able to self-organize, decide what their release schedule looks like, even decide what tools they can use. And so I look at that and say, well, you know, if I think about a startup and they're just embarking on their platforms, maybe that's a realistic sort of assumption to give them that much empowerment to pick practices and technologies. But when I think about an enterprise that needs to support what we build long after the developers have built it, I think about standards and putting those in place and putting some constraints in terms of what is self-organizing. So that to me is a very big part of this. Number three, I think about reliable releases. And so, you know, there's a big notion today. We apply DevOps. We try to release more frequently and release in smaller chunks. And that's really important. But more important than that is that as we shrink the duration between releases and we increase the frequency of releases, I want to make sure that teams are equipped to make sure that these are reliable releases, that they're not creating defects or outages or security issues and coming back and asking the team to go fix things and patch things all the time. So the speed has to be balanced with reliability. And then in terms of culture, teams are under constant pressure to deliver. I've never seen a team have a backlog that looks comfortable. I've never seen a CIO or an IT organization say, hey, we have all the staff and platforms and technology practices for us to deliver everything the business is asking for us. And so to sustain a winning innovation change program for a long period of time, you actually need to make sure that your teams are feeling like they're winning. These are a mix of short-term wins for actually hitting the sprint roadmaps all the way up to reliable releases and then roadmaps. And being able to celebrate those things with the teams. Now, underneath that, what you're seeing are three things that I think are core to be able to deliver this. Agile principles, to me, are the things that a developer, a tester, an operator, a product manager has in front of them to look and decide what principles beyond the Agile Manifesto that are really important to teams. So if you are very customer focused and experience focused, you're going to say things like the customer is first, and we want to measure the impact of what we put out there. If you are in a highly regulatory environment, you're going to want to remind people that. And so those are principles that are very unique to every organization that I've ever worked with. A DevSecOps culture is really about balancing being able to put things out that are innovative and changing with the ability to make sure that they're reliable. And then an operating model is really about looking at the mechanics of the Agile process. What are releases? How do you handle defects? What percentage of your backlog are you dedicating to technical debt? These are all the things that become institutionalized as governance that Agile teams are following. Now, how do you actually put this into place? There are 4 different aspects of Agile planning that I actually work with organizations on. Continuous planning, what that is really about is, in addition to just coding every sprint, I ask teams to plan every sprint. It's a dedicated activity. There's time devoted to it. There's cards devoted to it. Planning is everything from brainstorming to doing POCs and spikes, which allow you to do R&D, to investigating root cause analysis on issues that are hitting the production environment, to actually writing stories and actually getting them estimated. A big part of the program is around estimating. You can't actually get to roadmaps until you take the points that teams are applying to stories and using that to start forecasting and using those estimates to then start building out roadmaps. And so I have a unique way of doing estimating with teams that'll give them confidence on the numbers they're putting against their stories. Releases, I'm actually a little bit traditional around that. And for those of you who have been in the software industry or know software models for a long time, I speak about major and minor releases and system upgrades as a more typical way of organizations delivering software than what DevOps tries to get organizations to do, which is more rapid daily delivery and deployments of releases, which work really well in environments where you can experiment more, where you might be able to do A/B testing, where you have a lot of automation in place, where your changes don't have a lot of organizational impacts. But for most organizations, I put in a lot of the disciplines around, how do you think about what a major release is and what's the change management impact? What goes into a minor release so that you reduce the risk of putting them out and being able to do them frequently? And how do you think about a system upgrade so that a system upgrade can patch a system or upgrade a database or change your underlying architecture without going in and introducing new functionality and capabilities that might actually introduce risk? The program then ends with monitoring. And so if software and applications are so much more critical to businesses today, I think a critical part of that is to go beyond your traditional monitoring of whether the infrastructure is running well and whether applications are up or down, or even if they're performing well. I want to know if the experience is working well for my key customer segments. I want to know if there's queries to the database that over time are degrading because the amount of data that's being put in there. I want to be able to look at costs and balance costs in my cloud environment to make sure that as things are scaling, I'm not introducing new cost factors that I didn't anticipate. And so to me, this is everything that goes into an agile operation, from the partnership that you have to do with the business on planning all the way down to the operating world in terms of what's working and not working with customers. So how does this look in practice? Okay, and again, I'm going to start from the perspective of the technologist on a team working on sprints, and they are largely focused on what I called agile delivery. It starts with a backlog. It normally has stories. The product owner is typically prioritizing them. You're putting in standards in terms of not the functionality that needs to get done and the acceptance criteria in terms of what needs to be tested, but you're also putting standards in place in terms of security, documentation, and you're actually doing things at the end of this sprint in terms of whether the team is happy or not. You actually take surveys and make sure that the health of the team is still what you expect it to be. I did a couple of write-ups recently at InfoWorld, one on shift left testing. This is the ability to introduce more automation and testing into the development process, and putting that automation in place and making sure you can actually do end-to-end testing as part of delivery. And then I followed it up just a month ago with another article on security and how to actually do security testing in the middle of your development process. And things like automating pen testing and putting static code analysis right in the middle of your delivery pipelines. So the notion of what goes into the delivery today is much greater than it was, say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, we were worried about just getting code out and making sure the builds work and making sure that we could hand this off to testers to be able to validate what we built. Today, there's a lot more automation and a lot more collaboration where delivery is happening. All aspects of delivery are happening within a sprint. I then think about deployment. Okay, so I have code, it's ready to go, and I'm now focused on the delivery aspects of putting them into production environments and making sure I can do them seamlessly. Now, when I talk about DevOps and I think about CI/CD, the ability to integrate and deploy code, into different environments. What's unique about that is we're taking the long scripted processes that talk to operators that said, push this zip file over there or a jar file somewhere, shut down a web server, turn it back on, check the log files to make sure everything is working, run this script to deploy something to the database, do these snapshots. All that kind of stuff gets scripted into a deployment process. And that's what makes them more reliable. And that's what makes them more repeatable. I introduce a whole bunch of other things into this deployment, the idea of feature flagging. So you can actually build a lot of code in parallel, but decide what parts of the code is being turned on and off, and for which customers it's being turned on and off. One of the things that I have to bring back from my old idle days back into delivery teams are things like incident management, right? I don't believe that even in the best of platforms, Agile, DevOps, and planning, that you're not going to have incidents that are happening in the production environment, things that you cannot anticipate. Microsoft Teams had an outage this morning. Why? There are tenfold more, probably maybe 104-fold more people using it for collaboration than they probably anticipated. So we need a strong incident management program to be able to take that feedback under extreme times. We also need good customer feedback to be able to say we can see where some customers are having performance issues and bring that back into the development process. So now that I have delivery and aspects of deployment and delivery functioning, I'm going to go back and think about how I'm partnering with the business. Now, the business, one of the things that organizations and CIOs come talk to me about is this notion of the difficulty getting businesses to prioritize. How do we have a discussion around MVPs? How do we make sure that what they're asking for has good business value? Where does an MVP begin or end? And so a big part of being able to estimate and share those estimations with them goes back to giving them the tools and the understanding of how to make decisions of what goes into an MVP. One of the things we do in my workshops is we actually ask teams to plan a very simple feature like logging in. If you think about logging in, it used to be a very simple, you typed in a username and password. You had functions like remember me, you had forget password, and you had some administrative tools that went into being able to administer users. Pretty simple MVP, but if you think about it today, we have two-factor authenticators. We have employees, we have consultants, we have suppliers, and we have customers that might be interfacing with our applications in different ways. We might have social logins so that we enable logging in with your Twitter or your LinkedIn account. So a lot of different capabilities go into such a simple feature like login. And then you need to have a discussion with the business leader and say, what goes into this first release? What is minimal based on what our users are experiencing and require? And so that's where estimation really comes to play, because when you start getting a sense of, what you can deliver in one chunk, and it's, 2 sprints worth of work, when you add a whole bunch of new capabilities, it's 7 or 8 sprints of work, it puts that element of cost and value together onto the same playing field. And you can have a discussion about what really needs to go into the MVP. In terms of getting to roadmaps, a lot of that gets down into using tools that come out of the Agile tools very well today, things like burn down. So as teams are building up their backlogs beyond a single sprint, right? And so you're going through brainstorming and you're doing some planning and you're planning features out, your backlogs are getting richer, and you're starting to be able to look at a burn down from a release or an epic perspective. You're starting to get a sense of what that forecast looks like and what that roadmap looks like, and taking that data coming out of your tools and being able to go back to your organization and explain to them, this epic of logging in has 6 features to it. We're going to be able to release 2 features at a time, and it's going to take us a couple months to get that out. So the muscle that needs to go into that is planning your backlog beyond 1 or 2 sprints of activity. and being able to use estimates with the team to be able to come back and understand how long and how big that backlog is. To do this, there's a lot of work that I work with product owners on and with technologists on in terms of using things like wireframes and coming up with architecture designs, looking at what the size of the backlog is around technical debt, coming up with spikes, which again are R&D stories, and building up that backlog beyond that next sprint so that we can make better prioritization decisions and better balance decisions. And what that looks like in practice is every sprint, each team decides how much time they can dedicate to brainstorming. Some teams I know do it twice a week. Some teams I know do it once every sprint. And it really depends on what kind of collaboration that's required to be able to pull this off. Inside those brainstormings, you decide what the priority for planning is. And so one day it might be a new capability. Another day it might be focusing on technical debt. Another time it might be thinking through a new user experience. The end of a brainstorming session needs to be a bunch of documents depending on what you're building. And it has to be a backlog of what needs to be built if you were to embark on this. And so you can see by going through a level of planning around this, you can start building up your backlogs in different areas that give you some choices in terms of what you need to prioritize. When you put all of this together, so planning, understanding business needs, and rationalizing prioritization, going into delivery, and then going into deployment, this is what I call Agile release management. And for those of you who have read my blog, I talk a lot about this. There's some folks who equate the word release to the point where you're ready to actually deploy. So releasing and deploying are two different things in my language. Releasing is really about starting from the point of let's figure out what the business needs, let's figure out what the technology needs, and start planning a release that might be 2 sprints out, it might be 4 sprints out, it might be this sprint. Putting a label on this so we know whether it's a major release and deciding that this is going to have new capabilities, or a minor release and deciding that we're just going to do fixes and improvements. Then taking our backlog, figuring out what can get scheduled into that release and what's a priority, then focusing on the delivery and deployment aspects of it. So that to me is what a release is. And so when you start planning this with teams, they have a lot more confidence in their ability not only to deliver and deploy, but to be able to plan the next release out. So I know I've been going into the weeds a lot for everybody, but one of the things I've done when I've done keynotes is be able to ask the audience a question, right? How many of you are doing Agile? And what I find is that every single person raises their hand. And when I ask a few more questions, there's some rumbling in the room about whether they're doing Agile or they're doing a mix of waterfall and Agile. And so I don't really care what you call it. I care about the impact and the results and the outcomes. And so I asked the teams of CIOs, I'm like, how many of you know with certainty that you have backlogs that are greater than 1 sprint in duration? And typically it's not that many people who are raising their hands, maybe 5% of the room. And so there's a couple of reasons for this. Maybe the CIO isn't close to this, or maybe the CIO doesn't have this. And so, you know, my message to everybody listening is this is critically important. Agile is your instrument to deliver changes. It's your instrument to improve off of legacy systems, be more customer facing, and be more data driven. And so a big part of this is being able to plan, understand business need, deliver, and deploy under releases. What does this look like when you put it all together? There's 3 things that planning actually gets you. The number 1 thing I like to look at is platforms. So being able to get teams to look at and decide what parts of their engineering environments need to become standards, whether it's architecture or data standards, and when to think about instituting new technical capabilities around monitoring, around automation, and how do you fit those requirements into the backlog so engineering teams can actually go and implement them. The second thing is around innovation, right? And so to me, this is around being able to put spikes in place, being able to do POCs, even hackathons, and empowering somebody like Dan who wants to go out and put something in front of a segment of users, get some feedback, see if it's working, turn it on and use feature flagging so that only a few users actually get to see this, and then go back to the drawing board in terms of how to make it scale. And then lastly, I think about the culture change. And to me, a big part of this is working with two different groups of people in the organization. Somebody that we call a product owner, whose primary job, people ask me, what is a product owner really supposed to be doing? Their primary job is to listen to stakeholders, understand customer needs, and come back to them and say, this is what we're focusing on. That's a really hard job. When I talk to product managers, a lot of them fall into the trap of being a funnel, taking everybody's needs and trying to push that down into engineering groups and trying to get everything done. And so a lot of what the product owner really has to do is make decisions over what's truly going to give value and when there's commonality of need and whether some investment is actually going to drive impact. So a lot of the feedback in terms of building backlogs up and estimating is a way to give that product owner some tools and knowledge around selecting what to prioritize, but then also what the MVP is. Lastly, I also think about the executive, right? And so I think about even your role as a CIO and what you decide to get into the weeds on and how you're engaging teams and how other executives are working with teams. And the most important thing to see really happening is to build up a trust factor. I trust my team that they're committing to their full capacity. I trust my team that they can deliver, and I trust my team to be able to actually get the job done. So that's my talk today on hopefully you get a better understanding of how to use Agile to transform your organization. 3 places to watch and learn from the information I share. My blog is blogs.starcio.com. If you want to sign up for my newsletter, you can do that with starcio.com/CIO chat. And then my handle when you see me on CIO chat is @NYIke. And then just a little bit of what I do outside of talking on Twitter and speaking is I do a lot of work with workshops around digital transformation, around planning and execution, around Agile, around DevOps, and becoming data-driven. So thank you today. Miles, thank you for having me. I think
Absolutely. Thank you for
I hit my time limit.
You hit your time limit, which was fine. So I do have one question for you, just because it occurred to me while you were giving the talk today. Jeannie Ross has been talking a lot about these kind of micro digital offerings. The folks at Open Group are calling it Team of Teams, and they try not to take credit for that because they say McChrystal came up with the term. And I think it goes even further back. So when you're doing these small digital offerings that are going for a subset of the population, how does Agile change in that kind of a world? How does it still remain useful? What you're thinking about when you're building for a subpopulation, very quickly offerings to solve problems?
Well, I think, so those are really important things, right? We want to be able to take an idea and be able to invest in it quickly and inexpensively, being able to put it out to market in robust ways, capture that feedback, and then decide whether we want to invest in it beyond that. I think the hardest thing is around this is coming up with the right standards that go into an experiment like that, especially in larger organizations that are, compliance driven, a little bit fear driven. They're not used to being able to put things out. They don't want to be the Facebook, we're willing to experiment and fail and make mistakes at that level. And so I think, going back to coming up with what your principles are and defining them for an operating model around experiments and what beta means for your organization and what beta means for your customers, and getting that alignment and saying, okay, we're going to put this out in beta. Here's what it means. And when we hit these KPIs, if we hit these success marks, here's the types of things that we're going to invest in to scale it, to be able to put APIs around it, or to get more teams involved with it around the user experience, or to connect this to the rest of our ecosystems for fulfillment and supply chain, all those things that really make something enterprise scalable. But what you really want to do is, come up with that bubble, that safe bubble that you can actually put something out and see it go to market.
Yeah, I think an accountability framework which defines all the things that you described is absolutely critical. And there are things where you'll initially think it's going for a small set of population, and then it becomes mainstream, and then you have to do all the things you described. So that's great.
Yeah, that's the good problem, right? We like,
That, that
right?
is the good problem. Well, again, I want to thank you for joining us today. This has been a great talk. We'll be sharing this with the people who joined CIO Chat Live 2.0. And again, have a great day.